What I hope lawyers going into disaster recovery housing work will take away from our session today is that disaster recovery is a civil rights issue. The long history of segregation and racism in this country plays out in disaster recovery just like it plays out in every other issue that legal services and people interested in poverty law take on. The most important skill I think lawyers can take into disaster recovery work is the ability to listen to the experiences of people and communities, and to think about the work not from the perspective of picking a legal strategy, but of figuring out which is the best strategy to carry out what communities and individual families want. The most important resource lawyers can turn to as they start disaster recovery work is other lawyers who have been doing this work for a long time, as well as people who work with communities and work in this policy area and are really experts in the field after way too many disasters.
Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here with you. You're on the brink of making a huge difference. One of the things I think that is important as people are beginning to focus in on work is understanding where you are in that process. And for some of you, it may feel, oh, I got here a little bit too late, right? The disaster happened, there's already been all these fights, all this organizing, there's this huge need. But the truth of the matter is that the process itself is so long, so honestly, so unjustly long, that you've barely missed a thing. And the work you will do will help just so many. So I'm just grateful for you all. One of the things that's very important to understand as you do your work is that the United States does not have a formal national disaster network. There's no framework, right? And so that is among the reasons why things are disjointed and why they take so long. There have been those that are proposed. When I was in the Obama administration, I helped work on proposing actually a legal framework for the country, could not move forward. And that is why there is money and conflicting authority, and why there is so much discretion in the system, because there is no great framework. And where there is so much discretion, not only is there the opportunity for abuse, but more there's the opportunity for people to get tired. And there's a lot of despair when there's so much discretion that is used, because there's a lot of fear, right? Somebody is always threatening somebody within discretion. And that is generally true in government, but it is true in disaster recovery. So what do I mean by all that? So for years, there's no budget set at a national level for what we're going to set aside as a nation for disasters. Okay. At the moment, there is a kind of a cover pretending that there is a budget, but there really isn't a budget, right? More, I think what's happening is that folks who have whatever their political ideology is want to limit the size of government. So it's more a discussion about, if we put so many billions here, where are the billions you're going to cut? And that's why why people are starting to rein in a little bit, because they don't want to make those decisions. It used to be, at a time of a lot less partisanship, that when the disaster struck, the nation felt it was their moral obligation to help. And regardless of party, people in Congress came together to fund what was needed. That is just no longer true, like of so many other things that are happening, and it also plays out in disasters. So as a result of that, more than before, it matters which party is in power in Congress. If your state happens to be one that is hit, like Texas and Florida, that is hit with a disaster when the presidency is in the political party of the governor, right, and also Congress, things change dramatically. They forget that they're arguing one day we want to limit the size of government, and the next day they're passing budgets, right? But that also means that as we move down the scales of government, one thing is what happens at the state level between a governor of the same party. And another thing is what happens in more urban areas, right? Which, certainly in these two states, not completely, but certainly in Texas. And Maddie can tell you all about that. Because the mayoralties are held by the opposing party, by Democrats, very different perspective, and it gets played out in very real ways. We'll talk about that. So as a result, we have no national, who's in power, we have no national legal framework, and as a result, every disaster is treated separately. They can have different rules. So in Katrina, Louisiana had 3 different sets of funding, 3 different sets of rules. Very, very difficult to manage from any level that you're working on them from, very difficult to manage. And that's true across, and my colleagues can talk to you more about what that has looked like locally. And as a result, it matters who the senator is representing the state, and it matters who the governor is, the particular governor. So you all had a chance, I understand, to hear from Riley Morse, right? One of my, I don't know, he's got to be one of my top 10 favorite human beings. And Riley faced off with Haley Barbour. But Haley Barbour, right, was the chair of the Republican Governors Association, right? Haley Barbour, you'll hear from Maddie the difference. Per capita, what Haley Barbour was able to get from Mississippi, right, left Texas in the dust compared to what Texas got for the same storms, or what Louisiana, So all of these things are real. Later off camera, you can ask me something else about that, and I'll say more. When you first begin, the big issue is, so what is the damage, right? And there is a fiction that we're actually going to capture the damage at that point. But we aren't. This is why you are not late. Okay. Because the actual damage has not yet been fully captured. The unmet need, right, that comes later, and we're just approaching that right now, right, will change the way that dollars are reallocated, right, how programs are redesigned. And as I said, we have no national structure. So FEMA comes in, and they begin doing their things, and you'll hear about the big difficulties of working with FEMA if you're poor. The Small Business Administration comes in because they help a bit higher income people qualify for other types of programs. And what essentially happens is that the FEMA data and the SBA data come rolling into Housing and Urban Development, who then has its own group of data folks who are also looking at all the data, but waiting and waiting and waiting and starting to look at other things. I think what is important about this is that at every point in this system, I spoke about discretion. So at every point in this process, even before a single dollar is allocated, right, and even before an amount is actually authorized, the power of politics, right, and of having data is really important. Let me give you a specific example. I'm from Los Angeles, and we have earthquakes. So you might, I don't know, some of you might remember the Northridge earthquake that really devastated huge parts of LA. One of the things that worked there is that folks in LA got it together and did mapping. Before there was really GIS, right? Did mapping. I mean, really had to put out maps of the city, had to do pinpoints, everything that they could to take in a map of the city that could be shown and worked with on the floor of the Senate so that the senators could understand what had happened to Los Angeles. 20 ghost towns within the city, all these kinds of things. I'm going to keep talking about data because you all are going to be a key to the data and how you all work together. So this idea that, well, they can only do service. How many of you have litigated? Okay. So, me too. Okay, so that adage about good facts make good law is apt in a disaster situation, right? Those that can really prove up the facts well, right, and can make it clear, this is where now GIS and some beautiful mapping are helpful for people to understand. This is how it works. Maddie can talk to you later more about what happened in Texas, But one of the things that changed the tide for us in Texas years ago was that we worked on a map. Now this is how, okay, life really is, right? The Secretary of HUD, the Assistant Secretary for, for Design and Research, Raphael Bostic, myself, and a couple of others worked on a map for 2 weeks of Houston so that we could, on one map, show what the damage really was and why we should change the way we were doing things so that public opinion in the press specifically could understand what we were saying. It wasn't even so much about convincing them. We just understood that they didn't really understand what had happened. And when we were able to do that map, and the Houston Chronicle put it on its front page above the fold, and that day the editorial was, and I'm sure to the shock of many Texans, the editorial led with, you'll remember, HUD is right. And remember that? Not something that gets said in Texas very often. But those are the types of things, and data really matters. And you all, the way you aggregate data, right, so that you can present it and be there for all these different things that happen is going to be key. So the idea of sticking together and working it out together and working with EJW to work out how you present it really matters. Okay. So a lot of all these things. Let's keep going. Who controls the money? Well, the lack of a framework means that the federal staff is sparse because they don't actually receive an annual budget allocation to keep staffing at expertise at a steady level. Can you imagine? Right? So every disaster that comes, it is now pretty much set that they're going to get some percentage of admin. And they are constantly hiring people on a special type of federal job classification, right, that gives you, you're only there while that money is there. So those are often 3-year jobs. So they're constantly hiring up. So you can imagine how long that takes, how difficult that is to run a business that way. That has some very serious implications for how the decisions are made about who controls money. Because I said there's no framework, because the congressional discretion to place as much pressure as they can informally, right, is there on that small group of people, they prefer state responsibility. So you always begin that. They may, someone may say something to you differently while we're thinking about it. I was privileged to work with them. I was the assistant secretary where this money all came in. No. Okay, you start with the state. And it's hard to blame them because as really hurricane season begins, you don't know what's going to happen, right? As a staff, and you're not staffed up, you don't know what's going to happen. So that's where we begin. So lots of congressional informal authority. It plays really tough on these different people, right? In the same way that Haley Barbour could call and somebody was doing this kind of thing, the same thing happened when President Bush was president and Texas had the disaster. Texas could pretty much get everything they wanted, whether it made sense or not, which is why Texas ended up getting into so much trouble, because the White House actually permitted a lot of discretion. And so when I arrived, right, because I come in after, I see the outcome of all that discretion and, had to start again. The other big deal here is that the money flows through what they call CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant. But it actually does not flow through the Community Development Block Grant. What it actually does is that since there's no national structure, they've decided that the CDBG generalized structure is the best way to get out a lot of money and the best way to have top-level rules. So a lot of procedures apply, but the true detail of what is allowed to be spent with CDBG dollars, none of that really applies because, again, every disaster is funded on its own and it can have different sets of rules. This plays into something else, though, that I think is important for you to understand. And that is the ideology of block granting. You know, these programs, federal dollars specifically to go in to urban areas and to rural areas, you know, came as a progressive political agenda. Well, when that was happening, it was understood that there wasn't capacity or enough capacity at local levels, right? And add to that discrimination and folks who didn't want to have capacity, right? The Congress and Democratic president empowered these dollars and national agencies, which is why HUD is actually founded, to bring that type of national best practice expertise to these neighborhoods. Block granting does the opposite. And now we have, it looks like the liberal position is to defend the amount of money in block grants. This is the big fight every year. What is the CDBG pot going to be? What is the home amount going to be for affordable housing? What is the emergency services grant going to be for homelessness? It's all about that. But in the shift of our country to center, right, almost center right now, block granting is part of that. Because block granting assumes that all knowledge actually lives at the local level. Does that sound like small government things to you, right? So that all real knowledge lives at a local level, that the federal government has little or nothing to add. Now, for me, the point is, you know, I worked at the local level. I was the housing director in Los Angeles twice, and I was deputy mayor there. And I understand the importance of designing at a local level to make decisions about strategy and where and how and what leverage is best at a local level. I absolutely believe that. But not everybody is equally experienced to make those types of decisions. And you can have knowledge of the neighborhoods, but local knowledge is not the same as local expertise. And that is what we're now facing. And disaster relief is a place, do you agree, where this, comes to a point, right? So, right, the issue of local knowledge is not the same as local expertise. So don't be confused when, right, people are telling you this is what we're going to do. It doesn't mean that they're not committed to their neighborhoods. It doesn't mean that they don't understand the neighborhoods well, but it may mean, doesn't have to mean, but it may mean that they don't understand the interrelationship of all of these different systems. And that is why capacity building is so important. And what we're watching happen on the national scene with disaster relief dollars is that more and more capacity building and technical assistance is being built into these grants because local communities and states are failing regardless of party, right? And in many ways, it's because we haven't gotten over, right? We're now on this small government. Well, that's taken hold in state governments too. So now there's no infrastructure of expertise in many, many places. One of the things I learned when I traveled around the country as assistant secretary was that only about 30% of the 1,200 grantees that received these federal dollars had actual mapping capacity. Right? We're facing a foreclosure crisis, and they didn't know where they should be investing. They had no infrastructure to go figure that out. Right? So in the Obama administration, we spent an enormous amount of time building capacity, right? And actually building a technical assistance business that could go out and bring the very best ideas to folks, right? Without building it inside. We put out a lot of money, hired the very best, and started to understand what could actually help people. And I'm happy to say that it's helped people, and it's helped governments change. I can tell you that in Houston, they were not doing so great many years ago. In fact, Houston was paying back, I don't know, was it like $30 million, Maddie? They were paying back $30 million to the federal government of CDBG and home and other dollars that they had not used appropriately, right? They just gotten it wrong, no infrastructure, mess. I want to tell you, it is very, very tough to be selected as a group that has to pay money back to the federal government. You have to work for that designation, right? And so they weren't prepared. So when the hurricanes came, when the storms came, they were not prepared and they needed help. And I'm so pleased that in the Obama administration, we committed to places like this and helped them pull up out of the ground, gave them enormous amounts of professional, like in the mud kind of help so that they could do that. And so this time around, when Harvey comes, still challenges, but not what we faced several years ago. Okay. So if you're not going to be working on expertise in the federal government, what are you doing, right? So that means is over the last 20 years, more and more the federal government has stopped hiring local urban, expertise, right? Has stopped hiring the people who really, really know how to build affordable housing, right? The one exception would be, or was, it's not anymore, was in the area of homelessness, where there were true subject matter experts that worked at HUD that really, really knew this nationally. She left, couldn't handle it. But for about 10 years there, serious expertise. So what's ended up happening is that the federal government in their regular work hires people who can get the money out, right? So now it's about getting the money out, because the value of the federal government, if it isn't in subject matter expertise, it's in getting the money out quickly, right? Lots of things get lost if that is your mission. If success and the things that you receive bonuses for, those kinds of things, are for your procedures on cleanly getting money out. I would tell folks that I worked with that we were the best ATM machine in the federal government, because that is right. So when the foreclosure crisis came and the recession came, we were able to use that to our advantage. We got money out, billions to communities to help them, and that's a good thing. But we also came in with enormous amounts of expertise to help them figure out how to best use the money. Okay. Disasters, we have help, but it is not a structure. Okay. Then what happens is that once the money starts to go out, we get back to the allocation. HUD focuses on the rules based on what? On what they have received in an authorization from the Congress, how much money there is, what special rules they are, and of course, depending on who you are, the governor, there are all kinds of riders in these bills about what you have to do special for somebody. So they ultimately approve, but there's lots of room for politics there, right? Because of all of the discretion that is built in. The big problem of that is that what HUD has is a big hammer. And that makes it difficult for them to use it, because they don't have the smaller level of tools available to them. It used to be, it's changed now, it used to be, for instance, that all money that went into disaster relief was called 0-year money. It meant it never expired. It never expired. When money never expires, you remove from the people who are monitoring you the ability even to do the big things, because folks on the other side know there's virtually nothing you can do to them, right? So in that situation, issues of equity are very, very difficult. They've now added in, but that could go away, but they've now added in a 6-year rule that the money has to be spent in 6 years. And I think that's largely out of the experiences of Katrina, both in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, but also Sandy in New Jersey and New York, of how long that has taken, how much money is left, that now began to say, we can't justify it. So when HUD now sends money down to the state, they monitor, but the hooks are now the state becomes a mini HUD to the local government, right? And in that, they have a lot of discretion. So among the big fights always is, how is this money going to be allocated? Can you get at it? And you can. So again, we go back to the situation of the more data you have, the better you present it, the more you are influencing HUD politically and every other way, while they are actually writing the NOFAs that are going to go out with the money. They won't tell you how much, but everybody knows because it's in the authorization about how much. But you can begin to actually push. So data matters. Now, you weren't here for that first allocation, but you're going to be here, you're here now, for the real program design. because the first allocation really isn't the one that is going to dictate that much, right? The big political fight in Texas was between the state and Houston. And as a result, the county rode along, thank goodness. And were able to get a political division. There's nothing in any congressional authorization that lays out how the money is going to be separated out, how they're going to manage it. This is all politically agreed to, right? And after one big fight, everyone went to Washington, D.C., and they actually brokered a deal at the table of how this was going to be run. But that could change because it's not in law. Okay. The big dollars right now are laid out according to the data that comes from SBA and from FEMA, knowing that there's unmet need. HUD almost immediately, and everyone else who knows what they're doing, begins contracting data people to start calculating unmet need immediately, because they're going to either get another authorization or they're going to redistribute the dollars. The clients that you all will be serving, if you aggregate it well, will have an enormous impact, that data, on unmet need and how programs are refined, right? Because one of the most, I mean, really one of the biggest deals about this money is that it is amendment after amendment after amendment for those 6 years. Refining, refining, refining. Where you know, what's left to do, what's new, what program worked, what program didn't work, right? What HUD has said, what the community has said, and that is, again, the data with the folks that you are helping will matter tremendously. I will tell you that it mattered to me when I sat in that chair in Washington. It mattered to me, right? I mean, it didn't hurt, of course, that you all know Karen Lash, of course. Well, Karen is one of my dearest and oldest friends. So it didn't hurt that Karen invited me to dinner at her house so that I could meet Riley, right? and we could begin that conversation. And after I heard the data, okay, that was done through direct service, that was aggregated in every way you can, and I sat there and I heard what he had to say about how this was actually being implemented, that we then started to talk about, well, the problem is that I'm so happy to meet you, but I can't do business with you in this way. Right, I can't, right, good to meet you, I can meet you, that's great, but I can't do business with you this way. And so then Riley began, and Karen, and many others, but those two co-conspirators, right, led the efforts to start working through all of the political processes that they had to go through until they get to the office of the Assistant Secretary. Without my help, right? Really hands off. These rules about distance, all these things really matter. So they did all that. But when they then came to see me formally, the kind of data and the kind of mapping that Riley was able to show me, right, convinced me that I could take, or that I should take, some big risks, right? Which meant actually going to the secretary and saying that I thought we needed to start all over again. Because a lot of these decisions had been made either before the secretary arrived, right, or before I arrived, right? So we were left with what was happening. They thought there was an agreement, and it actually helped me go back and say, I think we need to start, I mean from scratch, and figure out Mississippi, because there's something really wrong. So the data of legal services mattered, and I think most would say that HUD's intervention was a helpful thing. I'm wondering, so I've talked to you about your data. I also feel that it would be important for you as you are here working, whether it's in Texas or in Florida, to do your best to network with others that are working on this issue, not just yourselves. Go out so that you best represent your clients is what you're hearing from others, so that as you're providing the service, you're going with much more than what the rules of the program say, right? And what your client is telling you. That you understand what's possible because you are involved in what is possible with others that are working on it. Because as I said, it's all about amendments, right? So what you're learning is going to shape that. And if you yourselves as advocates really dig into this community that you're working in, right? And you start to hear differently, it will impact how you make decisions as you're sitting across a table from someone trying to help them. And so for me, foundations, other legal services people, city people, I'm wondering, Sarah Labowitz, I know, is going to be here in a couple of days from the Housing Department of Houston. And I think that it wouldn't be bad, for instance, if the city of Houston, through the Housing Department, were to issue a standing every 4-month invitation to fellows from this program to hear what they have to say about what they're learning, right? So those are among the things that you can do that tie into everything you're doing. My pleasure to be here with you today.
When I talked about having leverage like I would never have in my life to make change in Texas, that was Mercedes, who, who saved Texas and Mississippi, who took our fair housing complaint and said to the state of Texas, no, you have done it wrong. They did mapping, again, showing that money had been diverted out of the most impacted areas into areas in, further into the state that didn't have any remaining disaster damage, according to FEMA. And that map was extraordinarily influential. But also, said to the state, we're not going to move forward in giving you $1.7 billion. The state already had 1.3 until you work out the problems. And I guess the other thing that I would say about Mercedes is when she came to Texas, she came and talked to community organizing groups. She didn't just meet with the mayor. She met with us. She met with people who were really affected. And I know that made an extraordinary difference to them and to what happened in Texas. So I want to just describe to you as much as I can where we are in Texas. So Texas has been appropriated sort of 2 tranches of money so far. The first was $57.8 billion reallocated out of earlier disaster funds that hadn't been spent. That action plan was approved in May. 80% of all these funds has to go to the most impacted and distressed areas where then there's a HUD formula. So 80% of that money went to Harris County for buyouts. 10%, or 20%, sorry, which was $10 million, went to affordable rental, mostly in the sort of Rockport, Corpus Christi area. So that money's there, and mostly relevant in Harris County. The big one is $5 billion, which was appropriated by Congress in September 8th, 2017, so fairly shortly after the disaster. Once Congress makes an appropriation, HUD allocates the money between the states affected and issues a Federal Register notice with the rules for the particular disaster. That register notice didn't come out until January of 2018. So here's a pretty big chunk of delay right there. The Federal Register notice tells states they have to submit an action plan for HUD approval. And from the notice, it sounds like the action plan is going to have a lot of detail about what the state's going to do. It's going to tell you, programs and, all this stuff. It won't, and it doesn't. The action plan really does not have detail. It's got some helpful stuff in it this time around, but pretty much what Texas usually says in its action plan is, here's how we've suballocated this to regional councils of government. And then the regional councils of government do what's called a method of distribution, or a MOD, since I will slip into that acronym, which also generally just tells you, here's how we've suballocated it to local jurisdictions within the region. May pick and choose between some infrastructure activities that are eligible, may tell you which housing programs we're going to do, but again, it's really just a sub-allocation. And it's only when it hits the really local level and people start making applications for projects and putting together programs where a lot of the really substantive decisions about where is this money going to go and who's going to get it are made. So it's a real pain because it's much harder to track, possibly on purpose. As I said earlier, Texas has a real fetish for local control, regardless of capacity. And that is going to be, once again, an issue. This time around, so the state agency designated to administer disaster recovery is the Texas General Land Office. And this time around, they are going to be running housing programs at a state level, which I think is probably good based on past experience. I think first, appropriation, they suballocated to actually a different agency, but they suballocated to 18 separate jurisdictions, many of whom had never run housing programs before, so all of whom had to design a program and write guidelines, and it took approximately 18 months for them to get it right and to have guidelines that could be approved and they could start their programs, right? So there's, one of the issues, whatever you think about local knowledge, here's one of the issues with the suballocation. There's 18 more months where nobody was getting money for housing or for anything else, largely for housing though. As Mercedes said, Houston and Harris County are developing their own action plans. Houston's has been approved by the city council and has gone into GLO. The comments on the Harris County action plan are due tomorrow, if anyone wants to do some extra credit work tonight. And that's expected to be sort of approved and sent to GLO by the end of this month. So these action plans are going to be amendments to the state action plan. So there's going to be another public comment opportunity when the state approves them. So everyone gets another bite at that apple. Although I would say historically that comments are more about going on the record with what you think the problems are than making actual change. So the housing programs that GLO is going to run are a homeowner rehabilitation and reconstruction program. It's $1 billion, pretty standard. One of our issues with that program, I think I said in an earlier panel, trying not to repeat myself, the last time around there was a voluntary homeowner mobility program that let people move. They're not, as far as we can tell, doing that this time around. They're doing a lot more buyouts. So $275 million in buyouts. Again, we have real equity concerns about whether low and moderate income people are going to get enough to move. Harris County seems to be going to do it right based on their buyout guidelines. Comments are also due tomorrow on those. They are for the first time running a homeowner reimbursement program of $100 million. So they're going to give people who did repairs on their homes up to $50,000 to reimburse them. On one hand, this could be really problematic because if you think about who's got receipts, who's got contracts, contractor, all of this, that is probably going to disadvantage low and moderate income people. On the other hand, I'm hoping that that is going to do something to appease higher income people who are pushing very hard for this money, and we'd like to keep the reimbursement and rehab money, or reconstruction and rehab money at lower levels. We'll see. Affordable rental, $250 million, not enough. Needs to be more affordable than it will be. Post-Ike, the state, as part of the conciliation agreement, did proportional spending, so looked at how much unmet need was people under 30% of area median income, 31 to 50, 51 to 80, and did set-asides for those income categories. It looks like they are going to do that again for this funding, which is great, except for the problem of data. So I think that's how bad the data is in representing actual unmet needs. So I think, as Mercedes said, that's a place where data is really important. If you've got, if we can show no, these, our clients, the lowest income people really have more unmet need than is presented, we can really push on changing those allocations and those set-asides. There's an economic revitalization program, also $100 million, and it's loans to small businesses for creating or preserving jobs for low and moderate income people. That has not been a particularly successful strategy, I don't think, anywhere. So that will be very hard to monitor and to ensure that there are jobs that are actually going to low and moderate income local residents. There's $137 million for planning. It would be great if there actually was planning. Texas does not enjoy planning as a philosophical matter, but hopefully that may actually change. This is the first time I have, in my 11 years of doing this, I have heard anybody talk about mitigation. And we actually have to be prepared for the next time around. And even though climate change does not exist, this actually will get worse, and we probably should do something about it. At Texas, actually, they submitted an application for the NDRC money, I think, that was all about these great mitigation projects, but the state wouldn't let them use the words climate change in the application.
Florida either.
Yeah, which is, yeah, super helpful. So, they didn't get a grant because it was a grant about preparing for climate change. So what's coming up are housing guidelines. They've done a draft for public comment of the housing guidelines. We haven't seen the final yet. Some problems, lack of mobility, but some good stuff. They're proportional set-asides, and they're going to require affordable rental developments to take housing choice vouchers for the first time, which is very exciting and something we have been pushing very hard for. But those I think are going to be, you're going to be following clients through this process and being able to say, here's where the problems are, here's what's not working, is huge. I do policy and impact litigation, so I don't, for example, I don't have necessarily that on-the-ground knowledge, but I would love to have it from you so we can look at, if there is policy change that needs to be made that, you cannot do because of the restrictions, the data you can give me and the problem identification you can give me and other groups who have fewer restrictions is extraordinarily important in that. And maybe I should say the data I will call and request from you. The Federal Register and the State Action Plan said, we're going to sort of keep revising our needs assessment as new data comes in. Again, data. And then, so states running the housing programs and the economic development program for everywhere outside Houston and Harris each of these, oh, all right, I'm done. But keep commenting on the program. I mean, getting into the program guidelines is a big deal. Actually, one more thing. There's another appropriation of $5 billion coming. No idea when that Federal Register notice will be out. Appropriation was in March. It's $652 million for remaining unmet needs and $4 billion for mitigation. And there is going to be a big fight over that mitigation money. Big fight. People are going to want it to go to big regional projects, to the Ike Dike. But I think I certainly plan to push on, elevation and mobility. These are mitigation. We're moving people out of harm's way. Neighborhoods need to get, equitable infrastructure investment for mitigation. So that is what's coming down the pike.
I will just start by saying Florida is further behind in the process than Texas, and so I think it is actually very beneficial to hear about how things are happening in Texas. I think we have some things that are similar in terms of, obviously, we have the same federal requirements. We also have the same lack of specificity for the Florida State Action Plan in terms of opportunities for ongoing advocacy, both through formal and informal channels. So just to kind of give you some background about what is going on in Florida. So for the last Federal Register notice allocating the CDBG-DR monies that included Florida, the allocation is smaller than Texas. So we're looking at an allocation of $616 million. And the state did a state action plan. There was 14 days for public comment. We used that as an opportunity to start connecting with different partners, so service agencies, as well as to let the state of Florida know that legal services was planning to be involved in a way that we had not historically, and when I say legal, I mean the entirety of legal services throughout our state, to be involved in how money is coming into our state for long-term recovery. Cindy, who was at the earlier panel, was the only person to show up at the public comment session in Tallahassee, which is where our lawmakers sit, but most of our population that was impacted is not. So I think that's kind of important. So also a little bit different in Florida, our state is the primary, really the only way that funding is coming through. We don't have any local jurisdictions that are doing action plans. And the state has been pretty emphatic throughout the process that the money was going to be allocated centrally through the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, which also is the state agency that has been involved with and coordinating the immediate disaster response in conjunction with some of the other state agencies. So our state action plan, even with all of the lack of specificity, was recently approved by HUD on June 28th. And I had shared with Maddie one of the news stories talking about how Secretary Carson said it was a model plan. So let me tell you what this model plan included. So there's 4 main housing programs. Similar to Texas, we have a housing repair and replacement program, and that is where the majority of the funds, I think it's close to like 45% of the funds that are coming into the state, are being allocated. As I mentioned, DEO is overseeing that program. That means they are vetting the contractors that are going to be doing repair work. So everything is going through the state. So that it's called a housing repair program, but they also intend to replace some housing in conjunction with one of the other housing programs, which is the voluntary home buyout program, which I don't really know how voluntary it's going to be, based on the description of the program. So the voluntary home buyout program is also a DEO managed program, and it's focused on hazard mitigation. So leveraging the CDBG-DR funds along with any FEMA hazard mitigation funds that come in to buy properties. Primarily properties are located in floodplains. And so, in terms of some of the major concerns that Mercedes and Maddie have already raised in terms of the data, so there's the data that existed before, and then what the data is based on the work that our legal services programs have done. So one thing that the Florida Bar Foundation, who's sponsoring the Florida Fellows as well as the primary funder of legal services throughout the state of Florida, did in conjunction with the Self-Represented Litigation Network was they because all of the legal service programs report data as part of our grant reporting to the foundation, they were able to create and generate maps showing the impact of Hurricane Irma when it hit in terms of needs and communities that are served by legal services, which was very impactful. So when we talk about politics, our urban cores in Florida tend to be more Democratic leaning. Our rural cores tend to be more Republican leaning. And our clients are located in both of those places. And so being able to use that data to talk to representatives across the state and also to engage them to advocate at the federal level was really important. So we are a year later and we need some updated data because one thing that our state action plan doesn't do, and a big gap that happened following the disaster, is the focus on tenants and what happened to tenants who were displaced as a result of the disaster. Like many places, this is certainly true in Texas, we had an affordable housing crisis in the state of Florida that existed well before Hurricane Irma, and that just served to exacerbate that crisis. Unlike Texas, we actually have in the state of Florida a dedicated revenue for developing affordable housing. Because of how that revenue stream is set up, however, it has actually been rated every year to fill other budget deficits and has not gone to affordable housing. So I think we have a real opportunity to advocate for that affordable housing funding to be used to rehab and develop affordable housing in conjunction with the CDBG-DR funding. So that's one thing that is in the Federal Register notice that was pretty absent from our state action plan, is about how they are really going to commit at the state level to making sure that LMI and especially our ELI, extremely low income, 30% area median income clients that we serve are actually in safe and affordable housing. So I talked about two of the housing programs. The other two, and the title of this program drives me nuts. It is the Workforce Affordable Rental New Construction Program when we talk about politics, because there is a big push for workforce housing in the state of Florida, which basically assumes that people who are poor do not work. Anything about Our ELI families, most of them do work. Unfortunately, Florida is a service wage heavy state, and so we have lots of jobs that people have where they cannot afford housing in our state. So, the Workforce Affordable Rental New Construction Program is slightly different than the other housing programs because DEO basically is going to allow our state agency, the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, which funds a lot of funds and administers the affordable housing programs in our state, like the low-income housing tax credit program. We also have some state funds, some loan programs to fund affordable housing. So this development of new construction program is going through that state agency, which presents some opportunities and challenges, but again, opportunities for advocacy. And I just want to, because I know we're running short on time and we want to make sure that we can answer some questions, but I think the point about relationships and politics cannot be stressed enough. So, as legal service attorneys, we really have the opportunity to have relationships with agencies and organizations that serve our clients who are not in the legal field. So, and that presents opportunities because they can have conversations with people that sometimes we may not be able to have conversations with, but they are serving the same clients that we're serving. And what I mean by that, for example, is in the state action plan process, our state contacted local governments about kind of the needs that they were seeing. They did a whole survey to them. And we learned about that due to legal service programs having relationships with some of the affordable housing division folks in their local governments. So there was nothing on the disaster website about this survey that was happening. And it gave not only us an opportunity, but it gave other social service agencies opportunities to have conversations with local elected leaders who were going to be providing this information to the state. And we can put it in our public comments, but they hear it different when it comes from different people. And so, I think we have the ability, as attorneys, we get to be creative in some of the solutions that, the problems that we're trying to address and the solutions that we come up with. So I think we just should not, don't limit ourselves to thinking that it has to be through this litigation lens or through this policy lens. That we can make some of these changes, that definitely we should use those tools, but really we need to be thinking outside the box about how we get our clients' stories heard, and sometimes it's having somebody else tell those stories.
So my first real question was, this is for Mercedes or Natalie as well, perhaps, but I know you talked about sort of that mitigation strategy, and just in the few weeks that we've gotten started, it's been really apparent that a lot of the fear that people who might get buyouts in their neighborhoods have are that there are, in Houston in particular, developers salivating over that land because they can't wait to go ahead and put something up that's, and so I was curious what sort of within CDBG the limits there are, or within county and local government efforts there are to sort of create an integrated plan of these are the things we as a city hope to see mitigation, and where can we tie that into the CDBG program. So that's just my...
Sure. Do you want to start with the state?
So the land that's bought out under this and under FEMA programs cannot be used, cannot be redeveloped. It's got to be preserved as green space, as, you know, I think you can build like a gazebo and a park on it, but it can't be redeveloped. I think the issue that we are seeing is developers going in and buying up houses before this happens, and people maybe are not, you know, if a developer's paying them what they think the house is worth, they are not getting the extra help to move somewhere safer. I mean, I have, well, Mercedes is here for the coordinated plan for Houston, but we have not seen a lot of coordinated planning. So, you know, one of the fears is we are going to end up with sort of these zombie neighborhoods where some people have moved out and some people haven't, you know, and you've got 2 occupied houses on a block. And there needs to be a lot more planning about how we do buyouts and where we target them.
What Maddie says about, yes, once you buy it out, you can't redevelop it. So the big thing, though, is that developers, at least in Houston, are fighting to buy everything else, right? Where topography was never an overlay before, it has now become an overlay. And so what worries me more is that there will be limited opportunity for the government to go in as a first-level investor to secure the land that it needs to secure to be able to redevelop. If you can't do that, then those folks who get the buyout have nowhere real to go, right? And one of the most dangerous things is for folks to get a buyout and move to somewhere that is even more isolated and also impacted, right? That is also in a floodplain somewhere else. You know, this is one of the issues of having the money take so long to get here. You know, you can read back in the newspaper and you will see that Houston is in like serious financial difficulty. So that means that they don't have the dollars that they can upload, right, to go and do investment, right? They just don't actually have it. So they're dependent on this money coming forward. And that creates an internal pressure in the government to like, okay, get this plan out quickly because they're also counting, we need the money, we need the money, we need the money. And so the mitigation thing will matter how the city plans and how they coordinate. And we'll see what happens, but I can tell you that what I hear as we're doing this work are the things you would want a city to say, or the things you would want a housing department to say about the breadth of the problem and that they understand it and are willing to admit we have capacity here, we don't have capacity in this other situation. What are we going to do? And you know, that makes Houston today a very different place than Houston 10 years ago.
I was going to say, so for Florida, I think to the extent that folks are not able to be to participate in the voluntary home buyout program, they're, at least as the plan is currently written, and of course there are a lot of details that need to be further developed. But in some cases, people will have the ability to participate in the home rehab program, where basically if their home gets bought out, they supposedly are going to get funds to go buy a house someplace else, or they may be eligible for renter assistance for up to a certain amount of time. And so if the problem is that people are basically selling their homes before DEO can get their program up and running and operating, they are not going to have that ability. And so what is left for those folks in terms of recovery?
Just one more thing, and I think we're all hitting very hard on sort of planning and targeting, because $5 billion sounds like a lot of money, and it is in fact, I believe, the annual CDBG budget for the whole country. But it's really not when it comes to disaster recovery. Not everybody's going to get help. There are people from Ike who still are living in unrepaired homes. So that's why I think we're all talking so much about targeting and prioritizing and trying to get that money to the people who need it most, because it's, you know, it's sort of a terrible thing to say, but like there's not even enough money for our clients. So yeah, that's why we're really pushing on all this stuff up front.
Okay, does anyone else want to ask? Yes, okay, I had a feeling. I promise not to monopolize, but I have several myself.
I have a comment and then a question from that. I attended a community outreach meeting when they were preparing, the city was preparing the action plan, and I think it was part of the HUD requirement. That's what I understood, that they do outreach. And I also went as a member of the community. And what they did was they gave out these maps, blank maps of like your neighborhood. And they said, find your house, tell us how much water was in your house, and who else do you know flooded in the neighborhood? And we were stunned that you're asking us to tell you. FEMA has all that information. And then they had like a scenario. They had people in groups. I think they meant well, but we were sitting there and they said, well, we want you to tell us what's first to like fifth. What should the city do? Should they put the money toward affordable housing or buyouts? And one of the people in the group was a real estate agent, and we were just all looking at each other. And I was just wondering, were they just checking a box, or were they really going to use this information? The maps were blank. You had to find your street and find your house. And I thought it was stunning that it was a city was their meeting, that they could come and present that. But I think if they were doing these community meetings, I think they said HUD was requiring it. So I don't know if you could.
HUD does require input. One of the things that the government does the worst is community input. So usually, right, they would tell you, okay, this is this, this is this, this is that. What do you think about that? Oh, thank you so much. Right? And I think the difference here, I don't know which one you went to, there were many, like 18 or so. The idea really is that FEMA actually, this is the whole point. FEMA actually.
Share knowledge.
Right.
They don't share the information.
FEMA actually doesn't know. Right. Okay. They know some. Okay. They know some. And as you move into lower income neighborhoods, they know less and less because people, right, drop out early in the process. They disqualify them. If they're undocumented, they don't show up at all. If they're, like, all kinds of holes are left in the data collection that FEMA presents to HUD, which is why the unmet need number is so massive and why we have to do all kinds of pencil-like calculations to figure it out. So really, that was more of an effort. I don't know which neighborhood, but in a lot of very low-income neighborhoods, no one had ever asked them, and FEMA doesn't know, and so there's no data for these neighborhoods. So this was a way to actually, please tell us. Why? Because of the mitigation dollars that Maddie was talking about. It won't help if the city goes into a neighborhood and does repair and does all kinds of other things if they can't make an argument for the flooding and the mitigation and why it flooded, right? So that you can do those cleanouts there, right? So that's going to be the big fight, as Maddie was saying, between local, right, real mitigation and these big, massive infrastructure projects. So that's why it went that way. That is among the reasons in Florida why it took so long for something to get placed in the Federal Register, right? I had just a conversation with folks at HUD, which I really rarely do. And, but the same people, I worked with the exact same people. And they said to me, we can't put out something on Florida that the data's just not there. We just can't do it. In Puerto Rico, yeah. Well, in Puerto Rico, ni hablar. They don't know. Okay,
Yeah.
So they don't know. So, but yes, so anything like that puts real meat on the bones within your service areas are helpful. The other important thing is about, for me, unmet concentrations of need. The concentrations, because as Maddie said, there are still people living in homes in Florida and elsewhere that were damaged before, and what would be helpful to a city, both one that wants to and one that doesn't want to, okay, is to be faced with the data about concentration so that they're thinking more carefully with their planning dollars about where they are targeting the money. And so I'm certain you are going to be in places that are about concentrated areas of unmet need. And it would be important to be able to display them that way.
So I would just add, so there are several of us in Florida that are connected with some researchers at universities, and so we are in the process of gathering some of that, working with them to analyze some of that data for Florida. As far as the, and I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit more in the Fair Housing panel tomorrow, but some of the concentrated areas that have been impacted, you know, we have a history with segregation in our country. And so, you know, when you overlay some of the fair housing protected classes on top of some of the disaster data we're looking at, it paints a whole other different picture in terms of where some of that funding should be allocated, or explains why some of the decisions that are being made in terms of relocating some communities.
Does anyone else have, okay, you have one.
I'll give it right back to you. There was talk earlier about how Hurricane Harvey was kind of an equal opportunity disaster, and how this particular round of flooding affected lots of affluent neighborhoods, and especially in the surrounding suburban areas, lots of homes worth several $100,000 up to upwards of $1 million got damaged. There were levees that were about to fail. So now we have this other group of people who want their representatives to advocate for their infrastructure. And now you're going to have this fight between moderate and upper level income people and lower income people, all of which are equally deserving of some attention because their homes are also, you know, in danger and their families are. I mean, what is that advocacy like, and what are you seeing in terms of like the compromises that these two groups, or the advocates for each of these two groups, are coming to? If my question was clear.
Yeah, it is. You know, I think one of the upshots of it having hit very affluent areas as well is that Maddie's mentioned a bit ago about how there's much more discussion about mitigation, and how at a city council kind of open forum level, they're talking about, we just can't do this again. And I think that a large part of that is because of that it hit across, that so often it's the poor that's hit, and because of segregation, both economically and racial and all kinds of other things, they don't see the damage. The city has recovered, right? The freeways are open, that kind of thing. And now the issue of mitigation is going to do that. That is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the issues of concentrated unmet need. Because the way to start talking about how you invest and how you balance, it's not enough just to talk about all the individuals that need help because they get lost, and everybody that knows there's not enough money, right? So in that there's not enough money, people are just falling through the cracks, right? But when you start talking about concentrations and places and neighborhoods, and you can map streets, right? Now you can start to aggregate what that costs, including the mitigation of what it would cost. And now it makes it a better way, I think, to get at equity when you can present the data that way.
I mean, and I think this is a little bit of a harder question because people got flooded who weren't required to have flood insurance. So they don't, I mean, my job is, fighting for people who don't have other resources. And that's always going to be my bias. So people who could have afforded SBA loans and who had insurance and who had, even if that doesn't completely make them whole, they're not still living in mold-infested houses, right? But I think this question of areas where people basically couldn't know it would flood is going to be problematic. I mean, so far what I've seen of that battle is let's get rid of the requirement that 70% of this money serve low and moderate income people. So I think that sort of conversation, in part because we haven't done program guidelines and stuff yet, has not really happened.
Just sort of following a little bit on what Natalie was saying, and certainly all of the people in this room's interest in getting at that advocacy for those underrepresented people. For those of us that are limited to direct services and don't necessarily have the opportunity to do some of the sort of get the policy hooks in, what are some of the ways that you might envision us really helping to advocate for them? Are there is it when I have a compelling case, I tell that person they should think about putting it out there in the public? Was it driving them to civic organizations? For me, trying to brainstorm how I help when that's not really my direct role.
You know, when I was a young attorney, I sued slumlords in LA. And like at a big level, I sued slumlords. And in order to do that well, my systems mattered, right? My goal as a civil rights attorney was that if my name was on the pleading, right, that the defense attorney would say, oh, okay, here's that Mexican girl again, right? And that's about how you organize yourself, right? So what I would say to you is that a big way to help is the things that you all agree to before you begin, right? So are you uploading photographs? How would you ask people to help you categorize their damage, right? What would you put out to folks before they get to you? If you have this, if you have medical records, whatever you have, what is it? How are you going to gather it? Even if it isn't exactly what you need for that application, how do you start to hold it? And who else at EJW, outside of these folks being limited to direct service, are looking at the aggregation and understanding how to best use it and working with others? That's what I would do. When I did work like that, it made me a very dangerous person because I knew I had so much at my disposal to use. That and the idea that I'm assuming that anybody who's sitting at this table, who's made this decision to dedicate your life for these couple of years to this is not a job, right? Right? So this isn't just about the direct service that you're doing during the hours that you're doing it, right? The true advocacy is before and after, right? You're going to learn about these folks, and your obligation, I think, is to teach about what you're learning is going on, and that's where the aggregation. And that's why I'm so in favor of dig into these other organizations where this is opportunity for cross work, because it's about your whole life, right? At least for these 2 years, right? Time is going to go by anyway. You might as well make a bang, right? So it's about what you're doing before and what you're doing after.
So Maddie touched on this, but I think that this is so true. When the policy folks contact you looking for stories, return their calls. You're going to get I've been at an LSC organization. I've been at a non-LSC organization. You're going to be super busy helping your clients. And you're going to be doing very important work. But to the extent that you are seeing problems on the ground with these programs, we've both mentioned there's a lot of detail that's missing. So we have multiple opportunities for those of us that are at policy programs to try to push this to be right in the beginning. And some of you already have stories about things that did not work, and we can use that to try on the front end to get some good policies in place so that you are not having hundreds of people knocking on your door with issues that hopefully we can, one of the things that has come up is the issue of duplication of benefits. So just to give you for example, the Federal Register notice requires that the states have a definition. Our state definition is kind of very vague and fluid, and how that ends up working out and playing out in those cases is going to be very important in terms of our clients being able to access assistance or potentially losing assistance that they may have already gotten.
So I would say even within the LSC restrictions, you can do a lot more than individual single client cases. And I want to acknowledge this is not just going to depend on what the regulations are, but how your program interprets the regulations and their appetite for even coming close to the line. So I think, as Tracy said a couple of times, make sure you're not doing that. But I mean, I think things like community legal education. Do your clients know that there's a community meeting where they could show up and say, my neighborhood needs drainage, our house is flooded, we need this to be better? Do they know about opportunities for more public comment, or about who in local or state or federal government they might call to express their concerns? That they have a right to call their state representative and say, here's my problem. You can represent groups. If you have a, neighborhood group who is really concerned about what's, in the method of distribution or whether they're going to get a fair shake, you can help them write comments. You can represent them in that process. You can represent a group in litigation and on administrative complaints as well. So I think there's, a lot more scope than you might think there is. I mean, I used to be a legal aid lawyer, and I know how bad it is and what, the political pressure has been like, and that, there's really been a sort of narrowing of vision of what legal aid does to sort of individual representation. But there's a lot more that you can do within the regulations. So again, I'm just going to quote Tracy and say, be creative. Make sure your program's okay with it, and that's within sort of their rules or the funder rules, but you can be creative. You can do other things, and I think one of the most important things you can do is connect with grassroots groups and with your client communities and figure out what they need.
Okay, well, I just have one more, I guess, that I would like to sort of use as our wrap up a little bit. Some of this that was really interesting for me was the idea, and one of the things Sandra Brown at Lone Star always says is, for a lot of what we do, there are no Ds, there are no Rs, we just serve whoever, comes to us. And to hear sort of some of the more political intricacies of things to expect, one of the questions that jumped to my mind when I was listening to that is, it sounds like if there is an administration changeover almost at any level of government, that some of the CDBG program can be retooled in its entirety, and some of our expectations would need to be retooled as well. Is that?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll call you all back at that point. Okay, well, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for being with us today, and thank you so much. It really helped give all of us an overview of what
Best
the
of luck to you.
program is.
So, important things that came out of today's meeting. Good facts make great policy. And in a process that is years long, the situation changes. And so you have to be flexible about the use of facts and knowing your facts. Let me give you an example. When we first begin doing an allocation, there are larger items. You have to understand where the big problems are. And for that, big mapping helps. In Los Angeles, when we had a massive earthquake, what we were able to do was map 21 neighborhoods that were severely impacted. And we were able to take them to Congress and describe the story. And that allowed Congress to really understand and see on a physical map where the damage was. Later, as you move on, you start to be faced with something called unmet need. The initial data that is gathered by federal agencies isn't deep enough. And so as you move through, you start to understand where there are concentrations of people that have not been helped. So as folks are doing their work, they will actually be representing people that are in these pockets of unmet need. The data and the clear facts that they can present will help clarify for cities where they should be focusing these dollars of unmet need for which before they had no information. Important for people as they're doing this work. One is to place yourself in the history of this work. all of us have started somewhere, and we've all ended up contributing to making things better. And I think today's fellows, they're beginning that path in their career. One of the things that I learned myself, even though I've been practiced law for a long time, was that when I took a look this year at what it is that the federal government put out for money in Texas, I saw some of the work that had been done before in the last few years and that advocates had worked for. I saw it reflected. And so, one thing is just working with individuals and thinking that that's it. It's not it. As these things gather steam, I actually saw it reflected, all of that work in national policy. I think that any attorney that has worked with folks who need serious help and who have limited resources, there is a level of flexibility that a legal aid attorney has to have. You have to be able to take a look at the regulations you have, at the application requirements, and think broadly about how you help someone to qualify. It may be that they're missing one kind of a document, and because you thought a little bit through that flexibly, you're able to help them make the whole difference because they actually have that document at home, just nobody told them that that's something that they needed. I think the other important issue is perseverance. This is a long process. These plans at a statewide level are amended many, many times over the course of the dollars. And it is important to have a feeling of freshness because it's always going to be there with you. It is hard to work with anything having to do with government. And my feeling has always been government and these programs have enormous power. And the people who do better with them are those who can figure out the way of how you figure out a way to carry the extra weight that it takes with grace. And so when you're thinking beyond yourself, I think that's where you find it. And I think those are the types of skills that are needed. They're a lot about personal commitment, not just about professional skill. I think for attorneys doing this work, it is important to be able to reach back with others that are serving the same clients. So other service organizations, other organizing groups, they're going to learn and you're going to learn about how to better hone in on what your clients need because everybody is looking at these needs in a little different way. So one is being willing to reach out, being willing to hang out, and being willing to share. And to that, when you're sharing, the issue of your facts being clear. The issue of being comfortable working with data is very, very important now. Those data points and clear facts are going to be needed as the story evolves. And that's what's going to happen in a neighborhood, and that's what's going to happen with clients. Things evolve as the money starts to hit the ground. Justice is dug out of the mud. It's not just that to work with individuals is noble and satisfying. That's where change actually exists.